Hey guys, tonight we're doing one of those stories that sounds loud on paper, but in reality unfolds very slowly, very quietly, and with a kind of tired inevitability. So go ahead and dim the lights, put your phone face down, loosen your jaw, and let's gently drift into a city that had absolutely no reason to believe this would be its last bad day. Tonight, we begin with Constantinople. Yes, that Constantinople, the city that had been standing for over 1,000 years. The city that had watched empires rise, collapse, rebrand, collapse again, and then rebrand one more time just to be safe. The city that had survived plagues, crusaders, sieges, riots, religious arguments that lasted centuries, and neighbors who were, let's say, not great at knocking first. And yet, one morning in 1453, it woke up completely unprepared for what was about to happen. Not dramatically unprepared, not screaming in the streets unprepared, more like administratively tired, emotionally burned out, and structurally optimistic, which historically speaking is not a great place to be. Now, before we get anywhere near that final day, don't worry, we'll take our time. We need to understand why Constantinople thought it was basically immortal. Because when you believe you are unkillable, you stop checking the locks. Constantinople was founded in the 4th century by Emperor Constantine, who took one look at a small Greek city called Byzantium and said, essentially, yes, this will do. Let's make this the center of the universe. And for a while, he was right. Annoyingly right. The location was perfect, water on 3 sides, natural harbors, trade routes flowing through like a cosmic funnel of money, spices, silk, and very strong opinions. And then there were the walls. Oh, the walls. The Theodosian walls were not just walls. They were a statement. They were several layers of stone, towers, moats, and defensive confidence. They were the medieval equivalent of saying, go ahead, try it. And many people did try. Goths, Huns, Avars, Arabs, Russians, even fellow Christians during the Fourth Crusade, which was awkward. But the city kept surviving, sometimes barely, sometimes expensively, but surviving nonetheless. By the 15th century, Constantinople had developed a personality. That personality was tired, broke, and still better than everyone else. Which brings us to the Byzantine Empire in its final phase. A phase historians often describe with words like decline, fragmentation, and politely falling apart. The empire that once controlled vast territories was now basically the city itself, and a few nearby villages, and some memories. At this point, calling it an empire was more of a branding decision than a geographic reality. Let's talk about the people running the place. At the center of this story is Emperor Constantine XI, Palaiologos. Yes, another Constantine. Byzantium loved recycling names. It was comforting, like naming every dog Buddy. Constantine XI was not incompetent, which honestly makes this story sadder. He was capable, serious, and deeply aware that everything around him was slowly collapsing. He just didn't have the resources, or the manpower, or the allies, or the time. He inherited a city with crumbling walls, a shrinking population, and a treasury that mostly contained vibes and prayer. Still, he tried. He repaired walls where he could. He begged Western Europe for help. He even agreed to religious reunification with the Catholic Church, something deeply unpopular with his Orthodox population, because desperation makes you flexible. The response from the West was underwhelming. Europe was busy. France and England were finishing up the Hundred Years' War. Italy was busy being Italy. The Holy Roman Empire was existing technically. Everyone expressed concern, very sincere concern, mostly through letters. And then there was the other side of the Bosphorus. Enter Mehmed II, 21 years old, ambitious, focused, and absolutely obsessed with Constantinople. Mehmed didn't see the city as tired or historic or symbolic. He saw it as unfinished business, a prize, a capital waiting to be claimed. And unlike many before him, Mehmed prepared. He built a massive fortress, Rumeli Hisara, directly across the strait, effectively cutting Constantinople off from Black Sea supplies, which was a subtle move in the sense that it was not subtle at all. The Byzantines noticed, they complained, they protested, they sent diplomats. Mehmed smiled, nodded, and continued building. Inside the city, life went on. Markets opened, churches held services, people argued about theology, because of course they did. There was a strange calm, not ignorance. Everyone knew Mehmed was coming, but a belief that the walls had always worked before. This is where overconfidence becomes tradition. Constantinople had survived worse, people told themselves. Stronger armies, larger forces. And besides, God wouldn't let this city fall. God had invested too much. By early 1453, Mehmed arrived with an army estimated between 60,000 and 80,000 men. Constantine XI had maybe 7,000 defenders, including foreign mercenaries, including volunteers, including people who probably would have preferred to be anywhere else. The walls still stood, impressive, but aging. And then there were the cannons. Artillery had changed warfare, and Constantinople, for all its history, had not fully updated its security system. Mehmed brought massive cannons, including one famously enormous bombard designed by a Hungarian engineer who, in a deeply ironic twist, had first offered his services to the Byzantines. They couldn't afford him, so he went next door. The cannon took hours to reload. Sometimes it cracked, sometimes it exploded. But when it hit the walls, it left scars that had never existed before. Inside the city, repairs were made nightly, stone by stone, human by human. There was no dramatic panic, just exhaustion. The siege dragged on, weeks passed, supplies dwindled, hope became quieter. And here's the thing. Constantinople didn't fall because people didn't care. It fell because they cared while being completely outmatched. There's a persistent myth that the city fell due to one small gate being left open, the Kerka Porta. And maybe it was, or maybe it was several failures piling on top of each other, quietly like unpaid bills. Because the truth is rarely cinematic, it's administrative. By late May, the defenders were depleted, the walls were damaged, the Allies hadn't arrived. On the night before the final assault, Constantine XI attended a last service at Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral that had seen coronations, riots, iconoclasm, and incense for centuries. People wept, prayed, held candles. There was no speech for history books, just resignation. The next morning, the city was breached. And with that, a 1,000-year-old world ended. But we're not going to rush that ending tonight. We're going to slow it down even more. Because what's interesting isn't just how Constantinople fell, it's how long it believed it couldn't. Let's gently stay here for a while, and in the next part, we'll drift deeper into the final days, the small decisions, and the quiet human moments inside a city. that had simply run out of time. If you drifted off somewhere around the walls cracking and the candles flickering in Hagia Sophia, that's honestly perfect. That's the correct emotional state for late stage Byzantium. When we left off, Constantinople was still standing. Technically, structurally questionable, emotionally exhausted, but still very much there. The siege had been going on for weeks now, and by this point, the city wasn't panicking. It was settling into a rhythm, which is never a great sign during a siege. Every day followed roughly the same pattern. Ottoman cannons fired, walls absorbed damage, defenders patched holes overnight. Everyone woke up tired and repeated the process. It's important to understand just how small Constantinople had become by 1453. This was no longer the crowded, bustling megacity of late antiquity. Large sections inside the walls were empty. Fields existed where neighborhoods once stood. Entire districts were quiet enough to hear your own thoughts, which again, not ideal during a siege. The population had shrunk dramatically. Some estimates suggest fewer than 50,000 people remained inside the city. A city designed for hundreds of thousands was now echoing. That emptiness mattered, because walls don't defend themselves. People do. Constantine the 11th had to stretch his already thin forces across miles of fortifications, which meant fewer men per tower, fewer backups, and very little room for mistakes. Still, discipline held, mostly. One of the most interesting things about the final siege is how organized it was on both sides. This wasn't chaos. This was logistics slowly grinding people down. Mehmed II ran his camp like a machine. Supplies flowed, units rotated, morale was actively managed. Inside the city, morale was more personal. People clung to routine. Markets still opened in a limited way. Church services continued. There were arguments, because of course there were, about whether God was angry, indifferent, or simply testing everyone. Some believed the city would be saved at the last moment. A miracle, an angel, a Western fleet appearing dramatically on the horizon. Others were less optimistic. They packed what they could. They stayed close to family. They waited. The famous chain across the Golden Horn was still in place, blocking Ottoman ships from entering the harbor. It had worked before. It was working now, until it wasn't. In one of those moments that feels almost insulting in its cleverness, Mehmed had his ships hauled over land, on greased logs, across hills, quietly. One morning, the Byzantines woke up to find Ottoman ships sitting comfortably in the Golden Horn, which must have been a deeply unpleasant surprise, the kind that makes you sit down without saying anything. This maneuver didn't instantly doom the city, but it tightened the noose. Constantinople was now being pressed from multiple sides. Psychologically, that mattered. Constantine the 11th continued to move along the walls, encouraging defenders. He wore armor. He slept little. He did not flee. This is worth emphasizing, because history has seen many rulers quietly disappear when things go poorly. Constantine stayed. He knew what was coming. And then there were the mercenaries, most notably Giovanni Giustiniani, a Genoese commander who played a crucial role in defending the walls. He was experienced, competent, and very much human. Giustiniani's presence mattered. His injury would matter even more. As the bombardment continued, the Ottomans launched probing attacks, not full assaults, more like testing pressure points, seeing where defenses weakened, watching how quickly repairs were made. Inside the city, Supplies dwindled further. Food became rationed. Hope became quieter. By late May, everyone knew the end was approaching. Mehmed prepared for a final, all out assault. He gave his troops rest. He promised rewards. He made it very clear this was the moment everything had been building toward. Inside Constantinople, there were no speeches promising victory, only acceptance. The night of May 28th was calm, almost eerily so. Churches were filled, people confessed sins, enemies prayed side by side, Orthodox and Catholic worshiped together, a small miracle that arrived far too late. Constantine the 11th reportedly asked forgiveness from his advisors and officers, not because he believed he had failed, but because that's what you do when tomorrow is uncertain. He then returned to the walls. Early on May 29th, the final assault began. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't cinematic. It was waves of men moving forward under fire, exhaustion layered on exhaustion. The Ottomans attacked in stages, irregular troops first, then more disciplined units, then finally the elite Janissaries. The defenders fought back with what they had left: arrows, firearms, stones, sheer stubbornness. And then something small happened. Giustiniani was wounded. Accounts differ on how serious it was. What matters is that he left his post. His withdrawal caused panic. Not everywhere, but enough. Defensive lines depend on confidence as much as stone. Around this time, the walls were breached. Again, not in one dramatic collapse, but through accumulated damage, fatigue, and inevitability. Constantine the 11th is believed to have thrown off his imperial insignia and joined the fighting as an ordinary soldier. His body was never conclusively identified, which is oddly fitting. By mid-morning, the city was lost. Ottoman troops poured in. The ancient capital fell silent. And just like that, a 1,000-year-old empire ended not with thunder, but with tired men stepping over broken stone. Mehmed II entered the city later that day. He reportedly rode to Hagia Sophia, dismounted, and ordered it preserved. The city was now his. Constantinople would become Istanbul. A new chapter would begin. But tonight, we're less interested in what came next, and more in what quietly slipped away. Because what makes this story linger isn't just the fall of a city. It's the long belief that it couldn't happen. An empire sustained by walls, faith, and habit, finally meeting a world that had moved on. In the next part, we'll drift into the aftermath, the survivors, the symbolism, and the strange calm that settles after history closes a very old book. When a city falls in movies, everything ends with fire, shouting, and dramatic music. In reality, it ends with paperwork and people waking up not entirely sure what they're allowed to do anymore. On the morning of May 30th, 1453, Constantinople was still standing, physically at least. The walls were broken in places, streets were damaged, but the city hadn't vanished. It had simply changed owners. And for the people inside, that was the most unsettling part, because history didn't end. It just continued without asking their opinion. Mehmed II, now officially the conqueror, moved quickly to assert control. Not chaotically, not emotionally, methodically. He ordered looting to stop after a limited period. This wasn't mercy, it was practicality. You can't rule rubble forever. You eventually need a functioning city. Hagia Sophia, the spiritual heart of Byzantium, was converted into a mosque, not demolished, not stripped away, just repurposed, which is a theme you'll notice with Mehmed. He wasn't interested in erasing Constantinople. He wanted to inherit it. And that distinction mattered. For the population that remained, and there were many who survived, life became about adjustment. New rulers, new laws, same streets. People still needed bread. Markets still needed to function. Children still needed to be born, named, and fed. The empire had ended, but daily life had not. There's something deeply anticlimactic about that, and also very human. Mehmed declared Constantinople his new capital, which in a way validated what the Byzantines had always believed, that this city mattered more than everything else around it. He encouraged repopulation, invited Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and others to settle there. The city slowly refilled with noise, not the same noise, but noise nonetheless. As for Constantine the XI, his absence became legend. Stories circulated. Some claimed he would return, that he hadn't truly died, that he was merely sleeping, waiting for the city to be Christian again. Empires often comfort themselves with myths when reality is too final. In the West, the reaction was delayed shock, then regret, then intellectual panic. Constantinople had been a bridge between worlds, a library, a vault of ancient texts. With its fall, Greek scholars fled west, carrying manuscripts with them. This helped fuel the Renaissance, which is one of history's quieter ironies. The end of one world nourishing the rebirth of another. But inside the city itself, the mood was not poetic. It was practical. Who owns this shop now? Who controls this land? Who do we pay taxes to? History is often shaped less by battles than by those questions. Mehmed II walked through the city and reportedly admired its monuments. He did not see a defeated enemy. He saw a legacy worth preserving. And in doing so, he ensured Constantinople's survival, not as Byzantium, but as Istanbul. Which brings us to the strange emotional center of this story. Constantinople didn't really forget to defend itself. It defended itself as it always had. The problem was that the world had changed quietly around it. Cannons replaced walls. Centralized states replaced ceremonial empires. Speed replaced tradition. Byzantium was still playing chess, while its opponents had moved on to something faster and louder. And yet, for over 1,000 years, it had worked. That's what makes its end feel less like a failure and more like a long, drawn-out conclusion. There was no single moment when someone could have said, yes, this is where we went wrong. It was decades of compromises, centuries of strain, a slow narrowing of options. And in that way, Constantinople didn't collapse. It simply ran out of room to continue. The city that believed it was eternal discovered the one thing walls can't stop: time. And so the most powerful city in the world didn't fall in a blaze of glory. It faded into something else, still alive, still standing, just no longer what it once was, which is perhaps the most realistic ending history ever gives us. No grand final words, no satisfying resolution, but just continuity. And that, oddly enough, makes Constantinople's story one of the most human in all of history. In the next part, we'll gently zoom out. We'll look at what the fall of the city meant for the wider world, culturally, politically, emotionally, and why this moment still lingers in our collective memory long after the dust settled. Constantinople has fallen, survived, rebranded, and quietly moved on with its life, which is honestly more than most empires get. So let's gently zoom out, not dramatically, just enough to see what changed, and what very stubbornly stayed the same, because one of the strangest things about the fall of Constantinople is how inconvenient it was for everyone else. Europe didn't immediately erupt into chaos. There was no collective gasp followed by instant reform. Instead, there was confusion, then denial, then a long, uncomfortable pause where people realized something foundational had shifted and nobody had a replacement ready. For centuries, Constantinople had been a psychological buffer, a symbolic wall between Europe and whatever was happening further east. Even when the Byzantine Empire was weak, it still existed. And existence alone was comforting. Now that comfort was gone, Western chroniclers described the fall in mournful, almost exhausted language. Not panic, more like disappointment mixed with guilt. The kind you feel when you didn't show up for someone, and now it's too late. There were sermons, laments, letters filled with if only, and we should have, but predictably, very little immediate action. Trade routes shifted, slowly at first, then more noticeably. With Ottoman control over key land routes, European merchants began looking for alternatives. Sea routes, longer routes, riskier routes. This is where history does one of its signature pivots. Because while Constantinople was falling, Europe was quietly learning how to float better. Navigation improved, shipbuilding advanced, maps became more ambitious, and eventually someone said, well, what if we just go around? Which several decades later led to ships heading west, very west, accidentally new continent west. So, yes, in a deeply indirect, mildly chaotic way, the fall of Constantinople nudged Europe toward the age of exploration, not because anyone planned it, but because obstacles make humans stubborn. Meanwhile, inside the city now called Istanbul, life continued. Mehmed II ruled not as a temporary conqueror, but as a permanent administrator. He didn't just win the city, he committed to it. He repaired infrastructure, encouraged immigration, restored markets, maintained religious diversity. This wasn't altruism, it was competence. A capital needs people, people need stability. Stability needs rules. And so Istanbul became something Byzantium had once been, a crossroads, different languages, different faiths, different customs, all sharing the same narrow streets and very strong opinions. In a way, the city never lost its identity. It simply updated it. Which brings us back to the emotional core of this story. Why does Constantinople still feel like a loss when the city itself never disappeared? Because symbols matter. Constantinople wasn't just bricks and walls. It was an idea of continuity, of Rome surviving, of the past still being reachable. When it fell, people didn't just lose a city. They lost reassurance, and reassurance is hard to replace. Byzantium had been old, comfortably old, the kind of old that made the world feel stable simply by existing. Its fall reminded everyone that nothing, no matter how ancient, is guaranteed, which is not a comforting bedtime thought. But here we are, and yet there's something oddly soothing about this ending. The city didn't burn forever. The culture didn't vanish overnight. People adapted. Empires ended. Lives continued. History didn't explode. It adjusted. And maybe that's why Constantinople's story lingers so strongly, because it reflects something deeply human. We build systems. We trust them. We assume they'll hold because they always have, until one day they don't. Not with drama, not with warning, just quietly. And then we wake up the next morning and figure out how to live anyway. In the next and final part, we'll let the story fully settle. We'll reflect on what Constantinople teaches us about endurance, decline, and the strange calm that follows long endings. By the time history books officially close the chapter on Constantinople, the city itself has already moved on. Streets are being swept, markets are reopening, new accents are mixing with old ones. Empires, as it turns out, and much more cleanly on paper than they do in real life. For the people who lived there, the fall of Constantinople was not a dramatic turning point they recognized immediately. It didn't come with a title card saying end of an era. It came with new rules, new taxes, and the quiet realization that yesterday's certainty was gone. And that realization took time to settle in. Historians love dates. May 29th, 1453. Nice and precise, very satisfying. But emotionally, the empire had been ending for a long time. Decades of shrinking borders, centuries of borrowed strength, a capital city holding itself together through habit and memory. By the end, Byzantium wasn't defeated so much as relieved. Relieved that the waiting was over. Constantinople had been bracing for collapse for generations. Every emperor knew it might happen on their watch. Every citizen lived with that background anxiety, the sense that something ancient was running on borrowed time. So when it finally ended, there was grief, yes, but also a strange calm. No more pretending, no more hoping the past would come back, just adaptation. And that's perhaps the most important thing this story leaves behind. Civilizations don't vanish, they shed skins. The Roman Empire didn't disappear. It stretched, fractured, renamed itself, and lived on in laws, languages, and buildings that people kept using because they were still useful. Byzantium wasn't erased, it was absorbed. Its scholars reshaped European thought. Its architecture influenced Ottoman design. Its bureaucracy quietly trained the next empire how to function. Even Hagia Sophia didn't end. It simply changed the direction of its prayers. Constantinople, the most powerful city in the world, didn't forget to defend itself because it was lazy or foolish. It defended itself the only way it knew how, with walls, faith, and precedent. The tragedy wasn't neglect, it was timing. The world had moved forward while the city remained loyal to what had always worked. And for over 1,000 years, that loyalty paid off. That's not failure, that's endurance. There's something oddly comforting in that. Not everything that ends does so because it was weak. Some things end because they lasted long enough to meet a different world. And Constantinople met that world calmly. Tired, yes. Outnumbered, definitely. But still standing. Even now, the city remains. Still busy. Still layered. Still arguing with itself across centuries. Rome's eastern heart never stopped beating. It just learned a new rhythm. So when we say, the day the most powerful city forgot to defend itself, what we really mean is this. The city trusted its past a little longer than the future allowed. And honestly, after 1,000 years of surviving everything, that's a very human mistake. We're talking about a man who did not set out to rule the world. He didn't charge toward destiny. He didn't dramatically seize power in a thunderstorm. He mostly just stayed alive, which in ancient Rome was apparently enough. This is the story of Augustus, or Octavian, or Gaius Octavius Thurinus. He went through names the way Rome went through civil wars, frequently, messily, and with very little warning. And somehow, by the end of it all, he owned everything. Not because he was bold, not because he was terrifying, but because everyone else made extremely bad choices, one after another, like a long, tragic group project. So let's slow down, let's rewind, let's gently float back to a time when Rome was loud, violent, paranoid, and deeply allergic to stability. A time when being related to the wrong person could absolutely ruin your life, and being related to the right one could also ruin your life, just slightly later. Our accidental ruler is born in 63 BCE, which already tells you something, because this is not a calm year. Rome is vibrating with political anxiety. Everyone is suspicious. Everyone is armed. Everyone believes the Republic is sacred while actively setting it on fire. Octavian is born into a respectable but not spectacular family. He is not royalty. Rome doesn't even technically have kings anymore. They got rid of those centuries ago and never stopped congratulating themselves for it. His mother, Atia, is Julius Caesar's niece, which sounds impressive now. At the time, it was complicated. Caesar is powerful, yes, but also controversial, and constantly flirting with the idea of being assassinated. Octavian's father dies early, which is unfortunate, but also very on brand for this era. Men in Roman politics had the life expectancy of mayflies with opinions, so Octavian grows up quiet, bookish, sickly, the kind of child no one is placing bets on. He's not muscular, he's not loud, he doesn't dominate rooms. He reportedly gets ill constantly, which in Rome is basically a personality trait. If you were alive then, and someone asked, who do you think will rule the Mediterranean world one day? You would not point at this pale, coughing teenager. You would point at literally anyone else. Julius Caesar, however, notices him, which is where things begin to slide off the rails. Caesar doesn't have legitimate sons, which is awkward when you're quietly dismantling a republic and might want an heir. So he takes an interest in Octavian, not loudly, not publicly, just enough to be dangerous. He brings him closer, includes him in campaigns, starts shaping him. And Octavian, being cautious and observant, learns the most important lesson Rome can teach. Never look like you're trying too hard. Then, in 44 BCE, Caesar is assassinated, stabbed by senators who swear they're saving the Republic. They do this in broad daylight, in a public space, which is a very Roman way of saying, this will definitely not end well. Octavian is 18 years old and far away. He is not present. He does not fight. He does not react dramatically. Instead, he reads the will. And this is where history quietly changes direction, because Julius Caesar, in one final act of chaos, has adopted Octavian as his son, posthumously, legally, in writing, with witnesses. And suddenly, this unimpressive teenager is Caesar's heir, not his political successor, not officially, but his name, his money, his legacy, which is a lot to drop on a sickly 18-year-old. Octavian does not rush to Rome. He does not declare vengeance. He does not give speeches. He pauses. He assesses. He watches men twice his age immediately underestimate him. Mark Antony, for example. Antony is everything Octavian is not. Charismatic, loud, physically imposing, very confident. Too confident. Antony assumes Octavian is a temporary inconvenience, a child, a footnote. Octavian lets him believe that. This is a pattern. Rome collapses into another civil war, because of course it does. At this point, it's practically a hobby. Octavian forms an alliance with Antony and Lepidus. They call it the Second Triumvirate, which sounds orderly. It is not. They publish lists of enemies, people to be executed, property to be seized. This period is brutal, cold, administrative, like genocide done by spreadsheet. Octavian signs off on it, quietly, without speeches, without visible emotion. He is learning. Rome rewards restraint far more than rage. Eventually, as these alliances always do, it fractures. Lepidus is pushed aside. Antony drifts east, toward Egypt, toward Cleopatra, toward a lifestyle that screams, I am no longer paying attention. Octavian stays in Rome. He manages logistics, he handles veterans, he controls messaging. He lets Antony look decadent, foreign, distracted, because nothing terrifies Romans more than the idea that one of their own has gone native. The final war comes, not with drama, but with inevitability. Actium, a naval battle, Antony loses, Cleopatra flees. Both eventually die. Octavian is now alone, which is the most dangerous position in Rome, because Rome hates kings. They killed their last one centuries ago and still bring it up at dinner parties. So Octavian does not become king. He restores the Republic, officially, on paper, with great ceremony. The Senate thanks him, relieved, grateful, exhausted. They give him titles, powers, honorifics. They name him Augustus, which means revered, not ruler, not dictator, just spiritually important. And Augustus accepts, modestly, reluctantly, very slowly. He now controls the army, the treasury, the provinces, the laws, but technically, he is just a citizen. Of course he is, and this is where we'll pause for tonight, because next time, we'll watch Augustus do something remarkable. He will rule the world, for decades, without ever admitting that's what he's doing, and somehow, everyone will let him. Octavian had just finished winning a civil war by mostly letting other people embarrass themselves. Antony was gone. Cleopatra was gone. The Republic was, technically, still alive, in the way a houseplant is alive when you forget to water it for 3 weeks. And Octavian, now Augustus, was standing alone at the center of Rome, holding all the power while insisting he absolutely did not want any of it, which is always reassuring. Now here's the tricky part about ruling Rome after a century of chaos. Everyone is traumatized, everyone is suspicious, and everyone is deeply committed to the idea that this time things will be different. So Augustus does something very clever and very boring. He becomes the least exciting dictator imaginable. He doesn't sit on a throne. He doesn't wear a crown. He doesn't even live in a palace at first. He lives in a reasonably nice house on the Palatine Hill, which, yes, will later become extremely symbolic. But right now, it's just tasteful. He dresses simply. He attends Senate meetings. He listens. He nods. He insists repeatedly that Rome is free again, and the Senate, exhausted and terrified of another civil war, nods back enthusiastically. Yes, of course, free, very free. Meanwhile, Augustus quietly keeps control of the army, which is really all that matters. This arrangement is called the Principate, because Augustus is the princeps, the first citizen, not king, not emperor, just first. It's a title that sounds harmless, like he just gets to go first in line. In reality, he controls appointments, laws, money, and legions. But since he never says it out loud, everyone pretends not to notice. And honestly, after decades of bloodshed, most people are thrilled. Peace returns, roads are repaired, grain supplies stabilize, pirates are dealt with. Rome enters what we now call the Pax Romana. 2 centuries of relative calm, which is impressive and also deeply ironic, because it's all held together by one man pretending not to be in charge. Augustus is extremely aware of how fragile this is. He knows what happened to Caesar. He knows Romans don't kill tyrants because they're cruel. They kill them because they're obvious. So Augustus becomes subtle, painfully subtle. He refuses excessive honors, at least at first. He lets the Senate beg him to stay in power. He stages retirements multiple times. I am tired, he says. I will step back. The Senate panics. No, please, don't go. We need you. Fine, he says. If you insist, this is political gaslighting, and it works beautifully. But while Augustus is calm in public, his private life is less serene. Let's talk about his health. Augustus is sickly, constantly. He has stomach problems, skin issues, cold sensitivity, fevers. He is always one cough away from a rumor of death, which is stressful, because the entire empire is balanced on his continued breathing. He knows this, and this brings us to his greatest anxiety, succession, because Augustus does not have sons, which is awkward. Again, he has a daughter, Julia, and Augustus adores her. At first, Julia is intelligent, witty, well educated, everything Augustus wants Rome to be. He marries her off strategically, first to his nephew Marcellus, who dies young, then to Agrippa, his loyal friend and general. This marriage actually works. They have children, multiple. Augustus is relieved, here, an heir. But then Agrippa dies too, because of course he does. Julia is widowed again. Augustus, now visibly stressed, marries her to Tiberius, his stepson. This is not a happy marriage. Tiberius does not want to be married to Julia. Julia does not want to be married to Tiberius. Julia has affairs, public ones. Rome whispers, then talks, then gossips loudly. Augustus, who has spent decades preaching moral reform and family values, now has a very visible problem. His daughter. So he does something cold. He exiles her, publicly, harshly. No wine, no men, no luxury. Rome is shocked. Julia is devastated. And Augustus never sees her again. It's one of the few moments where his mask slips, where power outweighs affection completely. He chooses order over family, and it works, but it costs him. Meanwhile, his potential heirs keep dying. Marcellus, Agrippa, Gaius, Lucius, one by one. Rome begins to notice a pattern. Eventually, only Tiberius remains. Tiberius, brooding, aloof, unloved. Augustus does not like Tiberius, but he trusts him, which in Rome is higher praise. Reluctantly, Augustus adopts him. He prepares him, slowly. And the Senate once again nods along, because stability matters more than likability. As Augustus ages, he becomes more withdrawn, more reflective. He writes his achievements down, literally, a list of everything he's done. It will later be carved into stone across the empire. Because modesty has limits, he knows the system he built is fragile. It depends on illusion, on everyone agreeing not to say the quiet part out loud. But it's the best Rome has had in generations. In 14 CE, Augustus dies, peacefully, in bed, which is almost unheard of for Roman rulers. The Senate deifies him. Of course they do. Tiberius takes over. The Principate continues. Rome survives. And Augustus becomes something rare in history, a man who changed everything by insisting he hadn't. Next time, if you're still awake, we'll drift into what happens after the accident, when Rome tries to repeat this impossible balancing act, with much less charm. Augustus is dead now, which feels strange, because for most people alive at this point, he's been there their entire lives, like a mountain or a very polite wall, and now the wall is gone. Rome does what it always does when something important happens. It pretends nothing is wrong. The Senate gathers. They mourn. They praise. They officially declare Augustus a god, which is efficient. If you turn the founder of the system into a deity, it discourages criticism. Hard to argue policy with someone who lives on Mount Olympus. Then they turn to Tiberius. Tiberius, standing there, already looks tired. This is not a man who radiates joy. He does not sparkle. He does not charm rooms. He does not smile accidentally. Tiberius has the energy of someone who knows this job will ruin him, and he is correct. Now, technically, Augustus didn't appoint Tiberius as emperor, because emperors do not exist, remember? This is all still very legally fictional. Instead, Augustus carefully transferred powers to him over time. Tribunician authority, military command, imperium, all the buttons, none of the labels. So when Augustus dies, Tiberius already holds everything necessary to rule, and yet he hesitates. In public, Tiberius insists he doesn't want power. He asks the Senate to share responsibility. He suggests collective leadership. This is either humility or a stress response. The Senate panics. No, 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 no. Please, you take it. We insist. They remember what happens when power is vague. It ends in blood. Eventually, Tiberius accepts, reluctantly, uneasily. And just like that, the accident becomes tradition. Rome has a second, first citizen. The problem is, Augustus made it look easy, and it absolutely was not. Tiberius lacks Augustus's patience, his warmth, his instinct for illusion. He is competent, efficient, but distant. He does not play the Senate like a musical instrument. He tolerates them, which they can feel. Early in his reign, things are fine, uneventful, which again Romans secretly love. The borders are stable, the treasury is full, the army is loyal, but the mood is different. Augustus felt inevitable. Tiberius feels temporary, and Rome does not like uncertainty. Tiberius becomes increasingly withdrawn. He dislikes public appearances. He distrusts elites. He leans heavily on Sejanus, the head of the Praetorian Guard, which is never a relaxing sentence in Roman history. Sejanus gains power, influence, access, and Rome starts whispering again. Plots, trials, accusations of treason. Under Augustus, accusations were controlled, managed. Under Tiberius, they spread. People begin denouncing each other. Careers end overnight. Executions increase, not dramatically, not loudly, administratively. Eventually, Tiberius leaves Rome entirely. He retires to Capri, which is beautiful, isolated, and deeply symbolic. The emperor is no longer present. He rules by letter, by messenger, by silence, and Rome adapts uneasily. This is where we begin to see the long-term flaw in Augustus's accident. The system depends on the personality of the man at the top. Augustus was cautious, patient, obsessed with balance. Tiberius is resentful, suspicious, tired, same powers, very different results. After Sejanus is executed for plotting, Tiberius becomes even more isolated, even more bitter. When he dies in 37 CE, few mourn sincerely. And now Rome faces a dangerous question. If the first ruler was an accident and the second was a disappointment, what happens next? Enter Caligula. But we are not going there yet. That way lies shouting, horses, and emotional instability. For now, let's stay with the idea. Augustus didn't just rule the world by accident. He accidentally created a system that only worked once, a system based on personal restraint, on subtlety, on knowing when not to speak, and that is not a skill most rulers possess. The Principate survives, but it slowly transforms. The illusion weakens, the titles grow heavier, the pretense thins. By the time later emperors arrive, fewer bother pretending they aren't kings. Augustus would hate that. He wanted control without visibility, power without blame. And for one lifetime, it worked, which is rare. So when people ask how Rome went from republic to empire, the answer is simple and very Roman. It didn't fall. It drifted, quietly, politely, and it let one unassuming, unhealthy young man hold everything together as long as he lived. So, Augustus is gone. The Principate exists. Rome is stable, at least relatively. And yet, the story isn't just about him anymore. It's about the legacy of accidentally holding the world together. Because here's the thing, Augustus ruled perfectly. He knew how to stay alive. He knew how to manipulate appearances. He knew which battles to fight, which to let slide. He knew that the illusion mattered more than the reality. But he also knew that this balance depended entirely on his unique personality. It depended on subtlety, charm, patience, and foresight. When he died, that accident was over. Every subsequent emperor had the same powers, but none had his temperament. Tiberius, as we mentioned, was competent, yes, efficient even, but dour, paranoid, unable to replicate the gentle, quiet manipulation that had allowed Augustus to rule the known world without seeming to do so. After Tiberius, the pattern becomes clearer. The next rulers are messier. They misunderstand subtlety. They exaggerate authority. They believe that power comes from spectacle, not restraint. And Rome strangely tolerates this, at first, but all of it traces back to Augustus's accident. The very idea that one man could hold everything and pretend not to sets an impossible standard, a standard no one else can meet. Consider the imperial family. Augustus's efforts to secure succession through his daughter Julia and later his adopted heirs were careful, deliberate, exhausting. He lost sons, husbands, grandchildren. He exiled his own daughter to protect the system he had built. Every personal sacrifice he made was in service to a fragile, intricate political illusion. Yet after him, heirs inherit not just power, but the expectation of perfection. And humans, of course, are incapable of perfection. They are loud, emotional, prone to error and indulgence. This mismatch between expectation and reality is where history starts drifting into chaos. But let's return to Augustus, quietly for a moment. Imagine him in his final years, sickly, cautious, staring out over Rome, watching the roads he built, the armies he disciplined, the grain he stockpiled, and knowing none of it will last as he imagined. Not because it will fail catastrophically, but because humans are unpredictable, and control is a delicate illusion. He dies in 14 CE, peacefully, in bed, which is almost unheard of, and the Senate deifies him because why not? Better a god than a meddling mortal. And so, the man who accidentally became ruler of the known world leaves behind a system that works perfectly for one lifetime. His legacy is invisible, yet omnipresent. His empire survives, transforms, and adapts, but the magic of his personal restraint disappears with him. And if you think about it, there is something deeply human in that a single person's temperament can shape history. That quiet patience can hold empires together, and that accidents really, can have consequences that echo for centuries. So tonight, as you settle in, dim the lights, and exhale, remember Augustus. Not the conqueror, not the emperor in robes and laurel crowns, but the boy who survived illness, survived civil wars, and survived circumstance, who read a will, smiled quietly, and became the center of a world he never intended to rule. Because sometimes history isn't loud, sometimes it's quiet. It's a story about silence, about a place that was once full of people, full of life, full of the ordinary noise of daily existence, and then slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly, it stopped. People just left, and no one came back. I want you to get comfortable, maybe dim the lights a little, maybe even tuck yourself in. This story isn't gonna race at you. It's more like a slow drift down a river that bends and meanders, stopping now and then to look at the reeds. There is no rushing here, no dramatic plot twists, just the gentle unraveling of a civilization that, for reasons we can only guess at, decided to walk away. Let's float over to the Khmer Empire, or as most people know it, Angkor. You've probably seen pictures, stone temples rising like quiet, stubborn mountains out of the jungle, moss crawling over every surface. And yes, it looks impressive, maybe even magical. But it wasn't always just a photo op. It was once the beating heart of a society that stretched across what is now Cambodia, Thailand, and Laos. Imagine, at its height, maybe hundreds of thousands of people, kings, priests, farmers, merchants, every day, people walking, talking, sweating, cooking, trading, arguing over small things, getting frustrated because someone forgot to bring rice or because the canal was blocked again. All of it mundane. And then, somewhere in the late 14th or early 15th century, the quiet drift began. People started leaving. First, maybe a family here or there, then a neighborhood, then entire districts. And the city, which had once rung with the sounds of life, gradually became more like the temples themselves, still moss covered, echoing slightly with the footsteps of ghosts. It's hard to pinpoint exactly why. Scholars argue over climate change, over water management failures, over shifting trade routes, over wars, over disease. But if you're lying in bed listening to this, trying to feel a little sleepy, here's what I want you to imagine. It wasn't a catastrophe. There was no dramatic fire, no sudden invasion, no terrifying plague sweeping through in a single night. It was subtle, almost lazy. One day, people woke up and decided that the city wasn't worth the effort anymore, that the canals were too tedious, the rice fields too unreliable, the temples too cumbersome to maintain, and so they walked away. And they didn't come back, at least not in the same numbers. Later generations might wander in, curious. Maybe a monk would take up residence in a half-collapsed temple. But the civilization as it once existed, the organized, bustling, bureaucratic, ritual-heavy civilization, just disappeared from that landscape. If you think about it, that's kind of strange, isn't it? Most history we remember involves movement, conquest, noise. But sometimes the quiet stories are even stranger. A city built with incredible care, with devotion to gods, kings, and community, abandoned for reasons we may never fully understand. And yet, it left traces, not just in stone and sculpture, but in the very atmosphere of the place. You can walk through Angkor today, or the ruined Mayan cities like Tikal or Copan, and feel a strange sense of emptiness that is not just the absence of people, but the presence of absence itself. Now let's slow drift to Mesoamerica. The Maya, a civilization with brilliant mathematics, sophisticated calendars, and the ability to map the stars long before Europeans could. Cities like Palenque, Chichen Itza, and Copan were hubs of politics, religion, and commerce. And then, one by one, the southern lowland cities began to shrink. Whole populations seemed to vanish in a century or two. Again, we can speculate about droughts, resource exhaustion, or internal political strife. But there's no definitive why. Just quiet streets, overgrown plazas, temples giving way to jungle. What's almost poetic in a very sleepy way is the gradualness. It wasn't a dramatic siege or a mass exodus with carts and animals. People just stopped showing up for ceremonies. They stopped tending their fields. They stopped maintaining the aqueducts. Slowly, almost lazily, the cities fell out of use. Nature didn't rush in violently. It just seeped in, quietly, moss by moss, vine by vine. And the thing about abandonment is that it leaves space for imagination. We can't know the exact thoughts of the last individuals who left. Did they look back with nostalgia? Did they shrug and say, "Hey, we'll try somewhere else"? Did anyone write a diary entry lamenting the loss of a city? We will never know. History, in these cases, is more like a soft whisper than a shout. Floating a bit further east, we can glance at the ancestral Puebloans in the American Southwest. Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon, cities perched precariously on cliffs, brilliant architectural feats, and then gradually silence. The stone homes and ceremonial kivas weren't destroyed, at least not entirely. They were simply abandoned, leaving the desert to reclaim the terraces and walls. Again, no dramatic end, just a quiet decision. It was time to leave. If you're following along in your mind, you might notice a pattern emerging. Great civilizations, intricate bureaucracies, vast urban centers, and yet humans occasionally decide that the effort outweighs the reward. And when they leave, the world doesn't notice much at first. Only decades later, centuries later, do we, modern humans, come across these empty cities and wonder softly about the people who were once there. And while we're floating along this gentle river of thought, it's worth noting that abandonment isn't always permanent. Sometimes new settlers come. Sometimes ruins become pilgrimage sites, or the location is reoccupied in a different form. But the original civilization, the way they lived, the rhythm of their daily life, never returns exactly. That particular pattern of existence is gone, leaving only echoes in stone, in pottery shards, in the faint lines of irrigation channels that the jungle or desert has reclaimed. So tonight, as you drift a little closer to sleep, consider the curious nature of quiet disappearance. It's almost meditative. No battles, no heroics, no drama. Just the slow, inevitable ebbing of human activity, leaving behind the skeletons of cities and the ghostly memory of communities that chose for reasons lost to time to walk away and never come back. And in the stillness of Angkor or Tikal, in the abandoned kivas of Chaco Canyon, there's a strange beauty. Not in the grandeur, though that's certainly there, but in the way absence itself becomes a presence. The quiet streets, the overgrown plazas, the empty temples, they tell a story about what it means for a civilization to end softly. So let's drift a little closer into the lives of the people who once filled these cities. Because, of course, before Angkor, before Tikal, before Chaco Canyon became quietly overgrown, and still, they were full of very ordinary humans doing very ordinary things. Not heroic things, not flashy things, just the small, repetitive motions of life. In Angkor, for instance, the city wasn't just temples and royal courts. There were families, and families have their small dramas. A farmer might wake up, notice that his irrigation channel had been slightly clogged by leaves, and think, well, I guess I'll fix this later, which, if multiplied by hundreds of thousands of people, may have eventually contributed to the city's decline. There were markets, merchants trying to trade rice, pottery, spices, children running barefoot over cracked stone paths, someone inevitably tripping and spilling their basket of goods, prompting a brief complaint, followed by mild embarrassment. Temples dominated the skyline, yes, but daily life wasn't entirely spiritual. People still had mundane concerns: meals, clothes, water. And religion, while central, was as much about bureaucracy and ritual as devotion. Priests kept meticulous records, performed elaborate ceremonies, and ensured that the gods were sufficiently appeased, or at least adequately entertained. The gods, as far as we know, didn't protest when the ceremonies slowed down, which in hindsight might have been a problem. And then there's the royal class, because you can't have a proper sleepy history story without at least one slightly awkward king or queen. Kings of Angkor, or Tikal, or Chaco had enormous responsibilities, or at least enormous expectations. They were expected to manage canals, armies, and ceremonies. They were also expected to appear majestic while occasionally doing absolutely nothing of significance. Some might have spent hours deciding the angle of a statue, the precise location of a garden, or whether a festival should be on the new moon or the full moon. And yes, most of these decisions would have been slightly irrelevant in the long run. Let's pause for a moment and think about the Maya. Palenque, Copan, Tikal, these cities were complex. The Maya had hieroglyphs, calendars that could calculate astronomical events centuries in advance, and very precise architectural alignments. But they also had to worry about day-to-day survival. Fields needed tending. Corn had to be planted, weeds had to be pulled, and irrigation systems maintained. Someone, inevitably, forgot something somewhere, and over decades, those little lapses added up. And in Chaco Canyon, perched in the desert with its precarious cliff dwellings, daily life had its own kind of drama. Water was scarce, food had to be managed carefully, and yet children still played, elders still gave advice no one wanted to hear, and artisans carved pottery and decorated kivas with care. Life was life, important to them, almost irrelevant to the passage of time, which is why, centuries later, we are left only with the empty buildings. What's interesting, at least in a sleepy historian's kind of way, is that we don't hear much about personal heroics in these civilizations. Not because there weren't any, but because they were subtle, quiet heroics. Someone who maintained the aqueduct during a drought. Someone who fed their children while the market was empty. Someone who preserved knowledge for future generations. Small gestures, usually forgotten, but the quiet glue of society nonetheless. And then, for reasons that are still debated, people began to leave. Slowly, carefully, almost politely. Not in panic, not in chaos. Just a soft decision. We'll try over there instead. It seems easier. Families might pack what they could carry. Children might be confused. Elders might sigh. But there were no dramatic farewells, no last speeches, just the gradual cessation of the daily routines that had defined these cities for centuries. It's fascinating and oddly comforting to imagine that departure wasn't necessarily about failure. Sometimes, societies simply reached a point where continuing was optional. And when humans make things optional, nature tends to notice. The jungle creeps in, the desert shifts sand over terraces, moss and lichen claim stone surfaces, and slowly the physical imprint of civilization softens into the landscape. The buildings remain, yes, but the bustle, the complaints, the laughter, the minor frustrations, all gone. And yet these cities were never really empty. Not entirely. Ghosts of the past linger in architecture, in inscriptions, in remnants of pottery, in the faint outlines of roads and canals. There's a certain melancholic charm in that, isn't there? A gentle reminder that even after humans leave, the echoes of their decisions, their routines, and their habits persist for centuries. Sometimes I imagine a final day in these cities. Perhaps someone left a pot on the stove, abandoned mid stir. Maybe a child's toy sat forgotten in a corner of a home. A priest's ceremonial robes might have hung untouched. The king or local leader might have gazed at the sun over a temple spire, shrugged, and decided that today was not the day to attend the rituals. And then, slowly, the streets emptied and the world moved on, almost politely. History often emphasizes the loud, the violent, the immediate, battles, coups, and dramatic collapses. But the quiet endings, the ones where societies simply cease to participate in their own existence, are equally compelling in their own understated way. There's a subtle narrative here about choice, inertia, and human energy, about how a civilization can appear eternal for centuries, yet end without noise, almost without notice. And so, as we drift further along, it's worth observing one last point for this part. Human life is a mixture of monumental and mundane. Even the most brilliant engineers, the most devoted priests, the most powerful kings are ultimately bound by small, repetitive, ordinary choices. And sometimes those small choices accumulate into a single, final decision to leave, and the world keeps turning regardless. Now let's float a bit deeper into the less obvious, almost imperceptible pressures that may have nudged these civilizations toward quiet abandonment. And when I say nudged, I mean that ever so slight, persistent tap, like a mosquito buzzing lazily around your ear at 3 in the morning. Irritating, unrelenting, but not catastrophic. Take climate, for instance. The Maya and the Khmer both experienced long stretches of irregular rainfall. Crops would fail, rivers would run low, canals would clog. Nothing spectacular, just slow, cumulative inconvenience. Rice paddies dry, cornfields parched, and humans, being humans, notice inconvenience. At first, it's a problem they can solve. By the 10th year, it's an ongoing chore. By the 15th year, some people start thinking, maybe we'll just move closer to the water over there. Seems easier. And little by little, those thoughts become action. Families leave, fields go untended, canals fill with silt. And that, my friends, is how silence starts creeping in. Trade is another quiet culprit. Cities like Angkor or Tikal weren't isolated. They were hubs of commerce, with merchants traveling from faraway regions to exchange goods, food, and ideas. But what happens when trade routes shift? When a neighboring city grows more convenient, more prosperous, more reachable? The marketplaces start to thin. Merchants take their goods elsewhere, and suddenly, a bustling square becomes slightly emptier each market day. Not dramatic, not urgent, just quieter. And social pressures, too, have a curious, gentle weight. Cities are built on rules, ritual rules, political rules, etiquette rules. Some of these rules are small, like when to light candles in a temple. Some are enormous, like how water rights are distributed or who inherits the rice fields. But over decades, small frustrations accumulate, a few missed obligations, a slightly unpopular leader, a ceremonial mistake, nothing catastrophic, just enough for some individuals to think, well, maybe this isn't worth it. And eventually, that attitude spreads, slowly, almost imperceptibly, until entire families, then neighborhoods, decide to leave. It's a subtle pattern, repeated across continents. Angkor, the Maya lowlands, Chaco Canyon, no single dramatic disaster, no armies storming the walls, no volcanoes erupting, just small cumulative pressures, environmental, economic, social, that make the effort of staying feel optional. And humans, as being lazy geniuses that we are, often take the path of least resistance. Let's pause and imagine a family in Angkor during one of these transitional decades. The father is checking the canal again, muttering under his breath about fallen leaves and inconsistent rainfall. The mother is calculating how much rice they have left and whether it will last until the next harvest. The children are playing along the edge of the market, already noticing that fewer merchants are showing up. And somewhere in the distance, the king is making a decision about temple maintenance that may or may not matter to anyone outside the royal court. Slowly, imperceptibly, the family decides maybe tomorrow we'll try over there. Because, of course, life is easier somewhere else. It always has been. And civilizations, being collections of families, accumulate these small choices until the city itself begins to empty. Streets that were once loud with commerce and chatter become tranquil, almost meditative. Temples, once vibrant with ritual, stand silent, echoing the footsteps of the few who remain, or none at all. It's important to note that not every abandoned city followed exactly the same path. Some suffered slightly more dramatic declines, like minor warfare or political upheaval, but even then, the abandonment was often gradual. It wasn't like flipping a switch. It was more like a dimmer, slowly fading, a sunset stretching for decades instead of hours. And in that fading light, the mundane details of life, the daily chores, the minor complaints, the whispered rituals, become the final remnants of a once living society. And here's a slightly ironic thought. In their quiet exit, these civilizations left a gift for us. Their ruins, carefully reclaimed by nature, stand as a kind of soft, meditative mirror. They remind us that not all endings are loud or violent. Some are gentle, some are deliberate, some simply drift into absence, while the rest of the world keeps spinning. Imagine walking through Tikal today, or Angkor Wat, or Mesa Verde. The air smells faintly of earth and moss. Birds flit through the ruins. The stone structures, worn by centuries of sun and rain, remind us of human effort and ingenuity. And yet, the people who built them, who lived and argued and celebrated and worried within those walls, are gone. All that remains is their architecture, their inscriptions, their faint, quiet traces. A civilization slowly, politely, chose to depart, and we, centuries later, are left to observe the silence. So as you settle further into your blanket of sleepiness, it's worth reflecting on the subtlety of human decline. It's not always a sword, or a plague, or a volcano. Sometimes it's merely a series of small decisions, inconvenient canals, slightly parched fields, quiet frustration, shifting trade. The world doesn't notice immediately. The people themselves may barely notice. And then, over decades, the city is abandoned, nature gently reclaiming what humans once dominated. And finally, consider the emotional texture of that departure. There's a strange kind of melancholy in imagining the last baker finishing his bread, the last child leaving a toy behind, the last priest extinguishing a ceremonial flame, all while knowing that the rituals, the commerce, the daily chatter will never be resumed in quite the same way. It's a quiet sadness, not loud or dramatic, but persistent, a kind of lullaby sung by the past itself. The civilizations we've been talking about, Angkor, the Maya, Chaco Canyon, they didn't vanish completely into myth. They left traces, stone temples, terraces, roads, inscriptions, pottery shards, and irrigation channels. Silent reminders of lives once lived, waiting for someone curious enough to notice. And that, my sleepy listener, is where archaeologists, historians, and sometimes just very persistent hikers come into the story. Imagine stumbling into Angkor in the 19th century. The jungle has almost completely swallowed the temples. Trees grow out of roofs, moss blankets every stone surface. A French explorer, machete in hand, wading through dense greenery, discovers a massive temple rising quietly out of the undergrowth. For the first time in centuries, human eyes behold structures that have remained largely untouched. And yes, it's dramatic in a visual sense, but still quietly awe inspiring if you think about it. A city abandoned not because it failed catastrophically, but because it slowly stopped being necessary. The Maya lowlands tell a similar story. European explorers in the 19th and early 20th centuries found jungles concealing entire cities, often only detectable by the faint impressions of pyramids and plazas. The stonework is meticulous, precise, and clearly designed to last centuries. And yet, for hundreds of years, no one lived there to maintain it. Nature crept in slowly, almost politely, allowing roots to push through stone in a careful, measured fashion, as if testing the resilience of human construction. In Chaco Canyon, the desert preserves ruins differently. The arid climate keeps the stonework intact, but it also makes every abandoned kiva and cliff dwelling look stark, lonely, and strangely beautiful. Archaeologists arrive and find walls with small niches for daily tools, remnants of fire pits, and subtle traces of human activity. And they try to piece together daily life, wondering about the people who walked away. Why did they leave? Was it drought, social tension, a combination of small inconveniences stacking up over decades? The answers remain uncertain, and that uncertainty is, in its own way, comforting. It allows us to quietly imagine the lives that once existed without the pressure of definitive conclusions. What's fascinating and perfect for a slow, sleepy narrative is that these ruins reveal the mundane alongside the monumental. A temple with vast, imposing stone carvings sits next to a tiny home with cracked pottery. Markets once bustled in plazas, now overgrown with weeds. Steps built for hundreds of feet daily now witness only the occasional tourist or passing bird. And the contrast is subtle, gentle, ironic even. Humans invested enormous energy into making these cities magnificent, only to quietly leave them behind, allowing nature to reclaim them gradually. And here's a slightly snarky but gentle observation. We often romanticize discovery as if archaeologists uncover some lost treasure of action, intrigue, or bloody conflict. But most of the time, the story is much quieter. The treasure is a jar with a chip in the corner, or a staircase leading nowhere, or a perfectly aligned temple whose purpose was more ritual than practical. The drama, if any, lies in human curiosity itself, and sometimes in wondering, did anyone look back when they left, or did life just seem simpler elsewhere? Modern researchers now study pollen patterns, sediment, and isotopes to understand climate shifts and crop yields. They analyze trade networks, decipher inscriptions, and catalog every potsherd, every faint mark in stone. And in doing so, they reconstruct life at a level of detail that is quietly staggering. You begin to see families, farmers, artisans, priests, merchants, all moving through daily routines that on the surface seem simple, mundane, repetitive. And yet collectively, they built cities capable of remarkable endurance. And then, collectively, they walked away. There's a particular beauty in that, not in drama, not in conquest or victory, but in absence itself. Because when humans leave quietly, when civilizations drift into silence, the evidence they leave behind becomes something like a lullaby for the curious mind. Every ruined temple, every empty plaza, every abandoned terrace is a reminder of choice, of subtle pressures, of ordinary life quietly giving way to absence, that most history books barely remembered to mention him. So if you're already feeling cozy under a blanket, maybe grab a soft pillow, because we're about to drift gently through the life of a man who, by all accounts, managed to exist without much fuss, fanfare, or catastrophic blunders. In other words, the perfect bedtime story. This is the story of King Louis XVI of France, or as we might more fittingly call him in our sleepy little history corner, the king who was okay at being king. Yes, he was born into enormous privilege, inherited the crown at an age when most of us were still figuring out how to write our names without backward letters, and yet, somehow, everything he did felt, well, slightly ordinary. Louis was born in 1754 in a world dripping with velvet, powdered wigs, and a kind of ceremonial boredom that most people today can only imagine by watching period dramas. His upbringing was the sort of childhood most children might dream of if their dreams involved endless lessons on etiquette, Latin, and moral philosophy, paired with intermittent twinges of parental disapproval. But in typical royal fashion, discipline was mostly about appearances, because why teach someone humility when you can make them practice bowing correctly for 3 hours straight? From the start, Louis seemed designed to be just slightly less impressive than necessary. He was shy, introspective, and often stumbled over the simplest tasks of governance in a court obsessed with theatrical displays of power. Imagine being surrounded by sycophants, advisors, and courtiers, all waiting for you to make a decision, while your internal monologue mostly consisted of, I really hope no one notices I have no idea what I'm doing. That, in essence, was Louis XVI in a nutshell. And yet, in that quiet mediocrity, there's something fascinating, because while the rest of Europe was busy producing flamboyant monarchs with scandalous affairs and eccentric hobbies, people who made history books fun to read, Louis trudged along with a kind of tragic decency. He liked locksmithing. Yes, the King of France, heir to the Sun King's legacy, had a private hobby of fiddling with locks. Perhaps it was soothing. Perhaps it was the only arena in which he could feel in control. Either way, it's charming in a mild, sleep-inducing sort of way. His marriage to Marie Antoinette has been discussed endlessly, mostly in the context of lavish parties, infamous overspending, and a public opinion that hated her with a quiet, simmering intensity. But in reality, Luis's approach to marriage mirrored his general approach to life, tentative, cautious, and perpetually unsure of what he was supposed to do next. He was polite, dutiful, and surprisingly reluctant to assert himself. In a world that demanded flamboyance, he was a whisper. If we drift slowly to his reign, it's easy to see why history nearly ignored him. France was in debt, there were growing political tensions, and yet Louis's decisions were measured, hesitant, and often ineffective, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he seemed to lack the decisive charisma that makes rulers memorable. Unlike some monarchs who leave behind dramatic stories of wars, coups, or sudden reforms, Louis mostly left behind paperwork, endless, boring paperwork. And yet, there is a quiet, almost meditative quality to imagining this man hunched over ledgers, trying to balance a kingdom's finances while silently wishing someone would just let him be. His reign, unfortunately, coincided with the rumblings of a society that would no longer tolerate ordinary kings. And perhaps that's the ultimate irony. In a world that increasingly demanded spectacle, Louis XVI's ordinariness became his undoing. He was not cruel. He was not particularly incompetent. He was just ordinary. And as history often prefers drama to quiet, measured existence, his life slipped from memory in favor of stories, with more noise, more spectacle, more scandal. But for tonight, let's linger here. Let's float over the quiet chambers of Versailles, past the gilded mirrors and the echo of soft footsteps. Imagine a king who tried to do right, who liked locks more than power, and who somehow became a symbol of a collapsing order. Not because of his ambition, but because history forgot how to handle ordinary. As we move forward, we'll explore the small tragedies, minor missteps, and domestic oddities that filled Louis's life. From awkward royal ceremonies to the peculiarities of his court, there is a slow, gentle rhythm to his story, one that, if you pay attention, teaches us as much about humanity as any tale of conquest or bloodshed ever could. And now we'll drift softly into the world. Around him, the courtiers who whispered behind fans, the advisors who nodded politely while wishing for more decisive leadership, and the quiet personal moments that made him, well, ordinary. Like the time he reportedly fretted over choosing the correct fork for dinner, or when he worried for hours over how to greet foreign dignitaries without appearing gauche. These are the little stories that paint a picture not of a great king, but of a man attempting quite earnestly to navigate a world designed to notice only greatness. So as we continue, let's settle in and glide gently into the domestic world of Louis XVI. Picture Versailles. Not the shiny postcards of gilded glory you might imagine, but the quieter, slightly tedious corners, the long hallways, the echoing corridors, and the soft creak of wooden floors under cautious footsteps. This was his stage, and yet he performed with remarkable subtlety, or perhaps, we could say, with the kind of gentle awkwardness that most kings try to hide. Louis was a man of routine. He liked predictability. He liked order. And in a court where flamboyance and theatrics were currency, this tendency made him almost invisible. His mornings were spent attending to official business, audiences, paperwork, and endless ceremonial tasks that no one really paid attention to, except to record them in meticulous logs. These records, dry as they were are now our best windows into the life of a king who rarely made headlines for anything dramatic. And then there was Marie Antoinette. Oh, Marie. She has become the centerpiece of every story about him, mostly because she was anything but ordinary. She was lively, extravagant, and notoriously indifferent to public opinion, qualities that, in her own time, made her both fascinating and infuriating. Louis, by contrast, was cautious, shy, and utterly devoted to the quiet rhythms of domesticity. Some historians have suggested he may have even preferred the calm of personal hobbies, like locksmithing, to the chaos of court life. And perhaps, in another world, that would have been enough. But in late 18th century France, subtlety was not a survival skill. Their marriage, while politically advantageous, was awkwardly personal as well. Unlike some royal couples, they did not exude effortless charm together. Instead, there was a certain tentative politeness, a soft dance of mutual obligation. Louis reportedly struggled with intimacy, and their early years together were marked by delays and uncertainty, including the prolonged time it took for them to produce an heir, a point that court gossip found endlessly entertaining and which modern historians can quietly shake their heads at. Yet there is something quietly endearing about Louis in these personal spaces. He cared deeply for his children, even if his affection was expressed in the most understated way imaginable. He was not the kind of father who performed grand gestures or speeches. He was the kind of father who fretted over their well being, who tried to guide them with gentle instruction, and who, in quieter moments, allowed himself the rare pleasure of simply being present. And in a court obsessed with display, this was almost radical. Meanwhile, the French economy was in a slow, creeping state of dysfunction. Debt was high, taxes were uneven, and the population, especially the peasantry, was quietly simmering with discontent. But Louis, again, was not a dramatic reformer. He attempted fiscal reforms, consulted ministers, and tried to navigate the complex web of bureaucracy, but always with the same careful, hesitant hand. He was a man who believed in reason, in measured action, and in polite negotiation, qualities that, sadly, history did not reward when society demanded decisiveness. It is easy, in this slow narrative, to imagine the little absurdities of Versailles. Imagine Louis at a dinner party, nervously choosing which fork to use, while courtiers whispered behind delicate fans. Imagine him walking through the gardens, quietly observing the symmetry of the fountains, and occasionally pausing to ponder whether the world outside Versailles might notice him at all. And then imagine the world outside Versailles, moving inexorably toward revolution, largely indifferent to his inner contemplations. One of the more subtle tragedies of Louis's life was his inability to fully grasp the mood of his subjects. He wanted to be a good king. He wanted to balance tradition with reform, authority with fairness. And yet, his natural inclination toward moderation and reflection made him appear indecisive or even weak to those around him. It is a strange sort of historical irony that the man who was, in many ways, earnest and kind would be judged harshly by posterity for not being flamboyant or ruthless enough. Let's float for a moment to one of his quieter personal habits. Aside from locksmithing, Louis enjoyed reading, walking through the palace gardens, and engaging in low-key mechanical experiments. These were not the hobbies of a man seeking glory. They were the hobbies of someone who found comfort, in order, in precision, and in small, tangible achievements. While other monarchs might commission grand statues, declare wars, or throw opulent balls, Louis found pleasure in simple problem solving. And there's something oddly soothing in imagining a king quietly tinkering with locks while the world outside slowly unravels. As the years passed, small frustrations compounded, court intrigue continued, financial crises loomed, and the royal family's image was increasingly at odds with public perception. Marie Antoinette became a target for scorn and caricature, and Louis, in his habitual gentleness, struggled to navigate these social currents. Unlike other kings, he did not fight fire with fire, nor did he charm the public with ostentation. Instead, he persisted with a quiet dignity, which unfortunately was not the kind of thing that could stave off widespread unrest. In private moments, he displayed a kind of understated humor, a dry wit that few chroniclers fully captured. He could be self deprecating, make modest jokes about his own indecision, or quietly express frustration with ceremonial absurdities. These glimpses suggest a man who, if left to his own devices, might have lived a peacefully productive life. But the machine of history, it seems, demands spectacle, not subtlety. And so, as we glide toward the later years of his reign, it becomes clear why Louis XVI is remembered, if at all, as a cautionary tale rather than a heroic figure. His ordinariness, which in another era might have been an asset, became a liability. His dedication, patience, and quiet moral compass were tragically insufficient shields against the storm that would eventually engulf France. So, as we continue in our slow, gentle exploration, we will next examine the increasingly tense political climate that surrounded him, the small misjudgments that compounded over time, and the quiet, almost imperceptible ways in which an ordinary king became a symbol of extraordinary upheaval. We'll drift slowly through legislative sessions, awkward encounters with ministers, and the growing unrest in cities far beyond Versailles, always maintaining our calm, monotone pace, because after all, history does not have to shout to be fascinating. Picture Louis XVI sitting quietly at his desk, pens in hand, documents spread across polished oak, and the soft rustle of paper filling the room. Outside, the gardens glimmer in the morning sun. Inside, the king wrestles with numbers, taxes, and the kind of endless financial details that make historians either grateful or slightly bored. Mostly bored, in truth. France, during Louis's reign, was in a slow, creeping state of fiscal crisis. Decades of lavish spending, costly wars, and uneven taxation had left the treasury thin. And yet, in his characteristic way, Louis approached the problem with careful consideration rather than sweeping gestures. He consulted ministers, proposed gradual reforms, and attempted to navigate the tangled web of bureaucracy. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, just gentle, careful effort. One of his early attempts at reform involved appointing capable finance ministers, people like Jacques Necker, who tried to bring order to the chaos. Necker, bless him, attempted to streamline spending, balance the books, and introduce transparency, which in the royal court was almost revolutionary by itself. But Louis's hesitancy often undermined these efforts. He would consult, delay, and sometimes change his mind, which left the ministers quietly muttering behind closed doors while trying to explain why slow progress was progress nonetheless. Meanwhile, public discontent was quietly growing. Peasants labored under heavy taxes, Urban workers struggled with rising bread prices, and the nobility, well, they continued their elaborate feasts, oblivious to the mounting frustrations outside palace walls. Louis, ever the careful administrator, was aware of these issues but tended to approach them methodically, almost academically. He believed reasoned negotiation could solve problems that society increasingly felt required urgent action. This is where the subtle tragedy of his reign becomes apparent. Louis was not a tyrant, nor was he a reckless spender. He simply lacked the kind of decisive energy that history often remembers. He attempted reforms, yes, but always in small increments, always seeking consensus, always avoiding confrontation. In a world sliding toward upheaval, caution is rarely rewarded. The Estates General, convened in 1789, became the stage for this tension. Picture it: three estates, clergy, nobility, and commoners, gathered in a grand hall. Louis enters, calm, composed, and perhaps slightly bewildered by the intensity of the scene. The first two estates expected him to uphold tradition. The third demanded representation and change. Louis tried, as always, to mediate, to find a balance. He listened politely, nodded, and occasionally frowned at particularly long winded speeches. His approach was, in a word, ordinary. Meanwhile, Marie Antoinette continued her social whirlwind, attending events, hosting elaborate gatherings, and unintentionally becoming the face of royal excess. Louis, ever understated, did not counteract this flamboyance with theatrics of his own. Instead, he remained quietly in the background, working through the paperwork, trying to do the right thing. And yet, the public saw only opulence, detachment, and the slow machinery of a monarchy that seemed incapable of acting. The National Assembly emerged, and with it, a slow, deliberate challenge to the traditional order. Louis, ever cautious, attempted negotiation. He granted concessions when necessary and retreated when forced. Nothing sudden, nothing extreme. And yet, each careful step only made him appear reactive rather than proactive. He was, in essence, a king trying to govern with decency in a system that rewarded spectacle, boldness, and sometimes cruelty. Even in his personal demeanor during this period, Louis remained understated. Reports from courtiers and visitors describe him as calm, polite, and occasionally resigned. He did not shout, he did not rage, he did not storm out dramatically. He simply tried to navigate the tide as best he could with quiet dignity. For those hoping for epic speeches, daring actions, or dramatic confrontations, this period of his reign might feel almost hypnotically slow, a perfect fit for our sleepy bedtime exploration. And yet, beneath the calm surface, tension grew. The king's attempts at moderation were constantly misunderstood. His hesitancy was taken as weakness. His decency was taken as incompetence. Every small effort to balance reform with tradition seemed to drift gently into misinterpretation. Imagine the quiet frustration. A king trying to do his job with thoughtfulness, only to find history poised to misread every gesture. Let's pause for a moment and picture one of these quiet interactions. Louis meeting with a group of deputies. He listens. He nods. He carefully explains his reasoning, and then a small whisper travels through the room. He does not seem strong enough. And just like that, the whisper grows into a chorus. This is the subtle tragedy. A man who is not villainous, not reckless, but simply ordinary, suddenly finds the world growing restless around him. As 1789 unfolds, the slow march toward revolution becomes inevitable. The king's ordinary nature, once a harmless trait, now appears as fatal indecision. Each legislative session, each minor reform, each polite negotiation carries the weight of an entire nation's expectations. And in that weight, Louis continues his quiet, almost hypnotic journey through a reign that is remarkable not for dramatic achievements, but for measured attempts at decency in a world increasingly intolerant of moderation. The irony is almost poetic. While other monarchs might have used force, charisma, or spectacle to influence history, Louis tried the subtler arts, compromise, careful listening, and deliberate action. It was not enough. History, as always, favors those who make waves. Louis made ripples, gentle, calm ripples that, when observed in isolation, are fascinating, but when viewed in the tide of revolution, barely register. And so, as we drift gently toward the end of Part 3, imagine Louis XVI quietly writing notes, reviewing reform proposals, and walking the serene gardens of Versailles. Outside, France stirs with growing unrest. Inside, the king maintains his steady, deliberate pace. No shouting, no sudden heroics, just the quiet hum of a man doing his best, caught in a moment too large for his ordinary hands. So here we are, settling into the final stretch of our slow wander through the life of Louis XVI, the king who was so ordinary that history almost forgot him. Let's imagine the soft rustle of leaves in the Versailles gardens, the distant echo of footsteps on polished floors, and a world gently tilting toward change that even a careful king could not fully control. By the early 1790s, the atmosphere in France had shifted in ways that Louis could neither fully prevent nor entirely understand. The revolution was no longer a distant murmur. It was a tide, slow at first, then gathering momentum, brushing past the ordinary rhythms of court life like a quiet wind that eventually became a gale. Louis, in his characteristic fashion, attempted to respond. He agreed to constitutional limits, consented to reforms, and tried to negotiate with new political bodies. Nothing sudden, nothing dramatic, just his usual careful, hesitant attempts at decency. And yet, the world outside Versailles continued to accelerate. The people's demands were loud, their patience thin, and their expectation of decisiveness higher than Louis could comfortably deliver. He was, after all, a man who preferred locks, numbers, and quiet, observation to speeches and bold maneuvers. Every step he took, measured and cautious, seemed insufficient to the fervor around him. The extraordinary pace of history, it appears, does not wait for ordinary kings. In 1791, Louis attempted to escape France in what would later be called the Flight to Varennes. It was a quiet failure. The plan was careful, modest, and yet predictably doomed. He was recognized, captured, and returned to Paris under a cloud of suspicion. The gentle rhythm of his life had been replaced by the relentless pace of events beyond his control. The king who once tinkered with locks and attended politely to audiences now faced the slow unraveling of a world that no longer had room for ordinary rulers. In the months that followed, Louis continued to navigate the constraints of his reduced power. He was still polite, still cautious, still attempting to maintain dignity, even as the revolutionary government inched closer to complete authority. And here, perhaps, lies the quietest tragedy of all. A man who tried, above all, to do the right thing, undone not by cruelty, incompetence, or ambition, but by being unremarkable, by being ordinary. Eventually, the monarchy itself was abolished, and Louis found himself a prisoner, stripped of almost all authority, yet still retaining the calm, understated manners that defined him. He did not rage. He did not plead dramatically. He waited. He listened. He observed. And in the final chapter of his life, history finally took note, not for his achievements, but for his quiet, ordinary existence in the face of extraordinary events. In January 1793, Louis XVI was executed. The streets were filled with the inevitable noise of history taking its course, while his own life had been a slow, steady rhythm, quiet, methodical, polite, and almost entirely unremarkable in its ordinary nature. And yet, in that ordinariness, there is something oddly comforting. A reminder, perhaps, that not all of history is made by flamboyance, loud ambition, or dramatic gestures. Some lives are measured, gentle, and quietly persistent, and in that quiet there is still meaning. So as we drift away from the gilded halls of Versailles, past the soft echoes of a king's footsteps, past the meticulous locks he so carefully tended, let us pause. Let us remember that history does not always reward quiet decency, but that does not make it any less real or any less worthy of reflection. Louis XVI may have been ordinary, hesitant, and slightly awkward, but he was also sincere, careful, and in his own slow way, profoundly human. And now, dear listener, as your eyelids grow heavy and the world outside drifts into silence, imagine the calm gardens of Versailles, the rustle of leaves, and the gentle ticking of a king's quiet life. Let it soothe you, let it lull you, and let it remind you that not every story needs spectacle to matter. Good night, sleep well, and remember, even ordinary lives have their place in the grand, endless tapestry of history.